My name is Meredith Caldwell, and I've spent the last 17 years building something extraordinary from nothing. What started as late nights in a cramped garage has become Argentum Innovations, a $300 million sustainable energy storage empire. I was there when we filed our first patent, when we landed our first major contract, when we celebrated our first $100 million in revenue. I was there because I helped create the very technology that made it all possible. But memories have a way of fading in corporate boardrooms, and loyalty becomes a liability when new management takes over. What they forgot, what they chose to ignore, was that my name wasn't just on the company directory. It was carved into the founding license that made their entire operation possible. Every battery system, every storage solution, every innovation that generated their fortune traced back to intellectual property I co-developed and legally owned. They thought they could erase me like yesterday's coffee stain. They were about to learn that some stains are permanent and some names carry more weight than an entire executive team. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd arrived early, as always, to review the European market reports before the weekly strategy meeting. The conference room was empty except for the massive wall-mounted display that someone had forgotten to turn off from the previous evening's session. What I saw there made my blood run cold. It was an organizational chart, but not the one I knew. This version showed my entire solutions design division highlighted in red, with dotted lines connecting to what appeared to be a legacy consolidation box. Below that, in smaller text, were projected cost savings that exactly matched my department's annual budget. I stood there for several minutes, studying the diagram, memorizing every detail. The presentation was dated for next week's board meeting, and the presenter was listed as Nathan Grant, our new Director of Human Resources. Nathan had joined us 6 months ago when Cortland Holdings acquired controlling interest in Argentum. He'd brought with him a reputation for operational efficiency and a particular talent for making veteran employees disappear. The conference room door opened behind me, and I turned to find Nathan himself entering, coffee in hand, looking somewhat surprised to see me. "Meredith, you're here early," he said, glancing at the display. His expression shifted slightly when he realized what was visible. "I see you've gotten a preview of next week's strategic planning materials." "Strategic planning," I repeated, my voice carefully neutral. "Is that what we're calling it?" Nathan moved to the display controls, switching to a blank screen. "The company is evolving, Meredith. We need to ensure every position adds maximum value. Your contributions over the years have been substantial, of course, but we're looking at ways to optimize resource allocation." Resource allocation. I let the phrase hang in the air. And my resources, apparently, are being allocated elsewhere. He sat down across from me, adopting what I recognized as his practiced concerned manager expression. "We're exploring options, perhaps a transition to a more advisory role, something that honors your history with the company while allowing us to streamline operations." Advisory role. The corporate euphemism for ceremonial position, all the responsibility of caring about the company's success with none of the authority to influence it. I'd watched it happen to other industry veterans. They'd be given impressive titles, corner offices, and absolutely no real work to do until they either quit in frustration or could be eliminated entirely during the next restructuring. "I see," I said. "And when were you planning to discuss these options with me?" "Soon," Nathan assured me. "We wanted to have a complete proposal ready. You deserve that level of consideration." What I deserved, I thought, was honesty. But honesty had never been Nathan's strong suit. I'd done my research on him after his hiring was announced. His previous position at Dynamo Corp had ended with a class action lawsuit from terminated employees. The case was settled out of court, but the pattern was clear. Nathan specialized in making uncomfortable people disappear. "I appreciate your consideration," I told him. "I'll look forward to hearing more about these options." That evening, I drove to the storage facility where I kept my personal files. Most people didn't realize that in the early days of Argentum, before lawyers and corporate structures, we'd operated on handshake agreements and shared ownership of everything we created. The official intellectual property assignments had come later. But the original founding agreements, the ones that established who owned what, those were different documents entirely. I pulled out the fire-safe box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the original partnership agreements, the first patent applications, and most importantly, the technology licensing agreement that gave Argentum the right to use the energy storage innovations I'd developed. The document was dense with legal language, but one section had always stood out to me. In the event of termination of founder's employment without cause, or in the event of material breach of this agreement by company, founder retains the right to revoke licensing privileges with 90 days written notice. I'd never thought I'd need that clause. When our lawyer, Henry Whitaker, had insisted on including it, I'd considered it an unnecessary complication. Just covering all the bases, Henry had said. You never know how things might change. Henry had been right about a lot of things over the years. I decided it was time to give him a call. Meredith. Henry's voice was warm with genuine pleasure when he answered. It's been too long. How are things at the Empire? Complicated, I said. I need to ask you about something. Do you remember that licensing clause you insisted on in the original founding agreements? There was a pause. The revocation provision? Of course. Are you thinking of exercising it? I'm thinking of understanding it. If I were to be forced out, what would that actually mean for the company? Well, Henry said slowly, let's see. Your innovations form the core of their 3 primary product lines, and those generate approximately 60% of their revenue. If you revoked the licensing agreement, they'd have to cease production immediately or face patent infringement lawsuits. They'd also lose the ability to fulfill most of their existing contracts. And their international partnerships? Those would be particularly problematic. Most of their European and Asian distributors have clauses requiring clear intellectual property ownership. Any uncertainty there would give partners the right to suspend or terminate their agreements. I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. How long would it take to prepare revocation documents? If you're serious about this, I could have them ready within a week. But Meredith, are you sure this is the path you want to take? Once you start this process, there's no going back. Let me ask you something. Henry, if someone spent years building something and then was told they were no longer needed, what would you advise them to do? I'd advise them to protect their interests, he said without hesitation. When do you want to meet? The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Nathan waiting by my desk. He had a folder in his hands and that same practiced smile on his face. Meredith, perfect timing. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. I've prepared a proposal for your new role. He handed me the folder. Inside was a job description for Senior Strategic Advisor, a position that involved providing guidance on long-term vision and serving as a liaison with legacy stakeholders. The salary was 20% lower than my current position, and the reporting structure showed me answering to Nathan rather than the executive team. As you can see, Nathan said, we're offering you a chance to remain part of the Argentum family while transitioning to a role that better fits our current organizational needs. I read through the document carefully. The language was crafted to make the position sound important while stripping away any actual authority. I would have no budget, no direct reports, and no decision-making power. It was a golden cage designed to push me toward voluntary resignation. This is very thorough, I said. When do you need a decision? Well, we'd like to announce the reorganization next week, so ideally by Friday. But I understand this is a significant change, so we're prepared to be flexible. Flexible, another corporate euphemism. What he meant was that if I didn't accept their offer, they'd simply eliminate my position entirely and dare me to fight it. I'll need to review this carefully, I told him, and perhaps discuss it with my attorney. Nathan's smile flickered slightly. Your attorney? Meredith. This is just an internal reorganization. I'm not sure legal counsel is necessary. I always consult with my lawyer on significant career decisions, I said. I'm sure you understand. That afternoon, I met Henry at his office downtown. The building was old but well-maintained, with the kind of understated elegance that suggested both competence and discretion. Henry's office was lined with law books and framed photographs of his family, but his desk was clear except for a single file folder. "I've reviewed your original agreements," he said, opening the folder. "The revocation clause is ironclad. If they terminate you without cause, or if you can demonstrate material breach of the partnership agreement, you have absolute right to revoke their license to use your intellectual property." What constitutes material breach? Several things. Failure to provide you with information necessary to perform your duties. Deliberate exclusion from strategic decisions affecting your IP. Or any attempt to diminish your role in managing the technologies you developed. I thought about the organizational chart I'd seen, about Nathan's proposal to convert me into a ceremonial advisor. What about reducing my authority over the technologies I created? That would definitely qualify, Henry said. The original agreement specifies that you retain oversight of any innovations derived from your core patents. Taking that away would be a clear breach. And if I revoke the license, they would have 90 days to cease using your intellectual property or negotiate a new agreement. Given that your innovations are fundamental to their core products, cessation would effectively shut down their primary revenue streams. I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. What would you estimate as the financial impact? Conservatively, production shutdown, contract defaults, partner withdrawals. We're looking at potential losses in the hundreds of millions. The company's valuation would crater. And they'd try to fight it? Certainly. They'd argue that your innovations were work for hire, that the company owns everything you created. But the original agreements are clear about your independent contractor status during the development phase. You weren't an employee when you created the core technologies. You were a partner. I thought about Nathan's condescending smile, about the way he'd dismissed my 17 years of work as legacy costs. I thought about the organizational chart with my department highlighted for elimination. "Prepare the revocation documents," I said, "but don't send them yet. I want to see how they handle their next move." The next few days passed in a strange calm. I continued my normal work routine, attended meetings, reviewed reports, but I felt like I was watching everything from a distance. My colleagues seemed to sense that something was changing, but they couldn't quite identify what. On Thursday afternoon, I received an email from Nathan requesting a meeting to discuss my response to the strategic advisor proposal. The tone was cordial but firm, the kind of message that suggested my time for consideration was running out. I arrived at his office to find him waiting with Brendan Locke, our new CEO. Brendan had been installed by Cortland Holdings with a mandate to maximize operational efficiency and shareholder value. He was younger than me, with an MBA from a prestigious school and a reputation for aggressive cost-cutting. "Meredith," Brendan said, rising from his chair. "Thanks for joining us. Nathan tells me you've been reviewing our proposal for your new role." "I have," I said, taking the seat across from them. "It's certainly different from what I expected. Change is never easy." Brendan acknowledged. "But we need to position the company for the next phase of growth. That means making some difficult decisions about resource allocation." Resource allocation? The same phrase Nathan had used. I wondered if they'd rehearsed this conversation. "I understand the need for efficiency," I said, "but I'm curious about the strategic thinking behind eliminating oversight of the technologies I developed." Brendan and Nathan exchanged glances. "We're not eliminating oversight," Brendan said carefully. "We're consolidating it under a more streamlined structure. The technology will still be managed, just through different channels." "Different channels," I repeated, meaning people who didn't create it and don't understand its fundamental principles. Meaning people who are focused on maximizing its commercial potential. Nathan interjected. "Sometimes having too much emotional attachment to particular technologies can limit our ability to exploit them effectively." Emotional attachment. As if my deep understanding of the science behind our innovations was somehow a liability. "I see," I said. "And if I don't accept the advisory position?" "Then we'd have to explore other options," Brendan said. The company is evolving. Meredith, we need team members who are excited about the new direction. The threat was clear enough. Accept the ceremonial position or face termination. They probably expected me to negotiate, to ask for a better severance package or more time to consider. Instead, I smiled. I appreciate your directness, I said. Can I have until Monday to give you my final decision? Of course, Brendan said, looking relieved. Take the time you need. That evening, I called Henry. They're giving me until Monday to accept a demotion or face termination. I want to send the revocation notice tomorrow. Are you sure about the timing? He asked. Once we send it, they'll know you're serious about fighting back. I'm counting on it, I said. I want them to understand the consequences of their decision before they make it final. All right, Henry said. I'll have the documents ready by morning. But Meredith, once we do this, they're going to come at you with everything they have. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for it my entire career, I said. I just didn't know it until now. Friday morning, I watched from my office as a courier delivered the revocation notice to Nathan's office. The envelope was marked, "Legal notice, immediate attention required." And I could see Nathan's face through his glass door as he read the contents. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Within an hour, I received a call from Brendan's assistant requesting an urgent meeting. I took my time finishing the report I was working on before heading to the executive conference room. When I arrived, I found not just Brendan and Nathan, but also Margaret Chen, our general counsel, and Robert Martinez, the chief technology officer. The revocation notice was on the table between them, and the atmosphere was tense. Meredith, Brendan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. What is this? It's a legal notice, I said calmly. I thought the heading made that clear. You're threatening to revoke our license to use technology that belongs to the company, Nathan said. Technology that was developed on company time, with company resources. Actually, I said, if you read the notice carefully, you'll see that it references technology developed prior to my employment agreement. The core innovations that form the basis of our current products were created when I was an independent contractor working in partnership with the original founders. Margaret Chen opened a folder in front of her. Meredith, I've reviewed the employment agreements. When you became a full-time employee, you assigned all intellectual property rights to the company. All future intellectual property rights, I corrected. The assignment was not retroactive. The original partnership agreement specifically preserved my rights to the core technologies. This is ridiculous, Nathan said. Zeus. You can't just decide to take your toys and go home because you don't like a reorganization. I'm not taking anything, I said. I'm simply exercising rights that have always existed, rights that were clearly documented in agreements that everyone in this room should have reviewed before making decisions about my role. Brendan leaned forward. What do you want, Meredith? What would it take to make this go away? I want to continue doing the job I've been doing for 17 years, I said. I want to maintain oversight of the technologies I created. I want to be treated as a partner, not a liability. That's not how the company operates anymore, Nathan said. We can't have individuals holding veto power over strategic decisions. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to push me out, I said, standing. You have 90 days to decide whether you want to negotiate a new agreement or find alternative technologies for your product lines. I left them sitting there, staring at the legal notice that had suddenly transformed their simple reorganization into a potential corporate disaster. Over the weekend, I received several calls from various company executives, each trying a different approach. Robert Martinez wanted to discuss technical transition plans. Margaret Chen wanted to explore creative solutions. Even Brendan called personally, suggesting we meet informally to clear the air. I declined all of them and spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be a difficult few months. I organized my files, documented my contributions to every major project, and made copies of all relevant correspondence. If they wanted to fight this, I was going to make sure I had everything I needed. Monday morning brought a more formal response. Margaret Chen sent a letter rejecting my claim to the intellectual property and asserting the company's exclusive rights to all technologies. The letter was professionally written and completely wrong, but it served its purpose. It made the company's position clear and set the stage for the legal battle to come. I forwarded the letter to Henry, who called me within an hour. "They're going to fight this," he said. "Margaret Chen is a competent attorney, but she's working from incomplete information. The original partnership agreements aren't in the standard corporate files, they're in the founder's personal records. Which means they're going to spend a lot of time and money trying to prove something that isn't true. Meanwhile, we need to prepare for their next move. Which will be? They'll try to discredit your claim by arguing that anything you developed was automatically company property. They'll look for any evidence that you used company resources or worked on company time. They'll try to make this about employment law rather than partnership agreements." I thought about the years of late nights, the weekend experiments, the breakthrough moments that had come in my home workshop rather than the company lab. "Let them try," I said. "I have documentation for everything." The first public sign of trouble came on Wednesday. TechCrunch published an article about IP disputes affecting sustainable energy companies, with a brief mention of licensing uncertainties at Argentum Innovations. The article was vague, but the mere suggestion of intellectual property problems was enough to catch the attention of industry watchers. By Thursday, our stock price had dropped 12%. Nathan sent out a company-wide email assuring everyone that recent media speculation was unfounded and that operations continue normally. But I could see the concern in people's faces, hear the whispered conversations in the hallways. The real crisis began the following week. Horizon Energy GmbH, our primary European distributor, sent a formal inquiry about our intellectual property status. Their contract included a clause allowing them to suspend orders if there were any disputes affecting our right to produce and sell our products. I watched from my office as a parade of executives hurried back and forth between the legal department and the executive suite. Margaret Chen looked increasingly harried, and Nathan's usual confidence was showing cracks. On Tuesday, I received a call from Peter Klein, my original partner in founding Argentum. Peter had retired 5 years earlier, selling his stake to Cortland Holdings, but he still maintained contact with many of the company's veteran employees. "Meredith," he said, "I've been hearing some interesting rumors, something about IP disputes and licensing problems." "It's complicated," I said. "I'm sure it is. But I want you to know that if you need any support, documentation, testimony, whatever, I'm available. Those original agreements were as much my idea as yours, and I remember exactly why we structured them that way." "Why did we structure them that way?" I asked, genuinely curious. It had been so long since we discussed the reasoning behind those early decisions. "Because we didn't trust anyone else to protect what we'd built," Peter said. "We wanted to make sure that if the company ever got taken over by people who didn't understand or appreciate what we'd created, we'd have some recourse. And now it looks like we were right to be cautious. What do you need from me?" That afternoon, I met with Henry and Peter to review the original partnership agreements. Peter's memory was remarkably clear about the circumstances surrounding each decision, and his documentation was meticulous. Together, we built a comprehensive record of how the intellectual property had been developed and who owned what. The key point, Henry explained, is that the core technologies were developed before Argentum was incorporated. Meredith and Peter were equal partners, working on their own time, using their own resources. The company was formed specifically to commercialize their innovations. And the licensing agreement? That came later, when they decided to bring in outside investors. They granted the company an exclusive license to use their technologies, but they retained ownership. It was a way to attract investment while protecting their rights. So when Cortland Holdings bought the company, they bought the license, not the underlying IP? Exactly. And now they're trying to eliminate one of the licensors, which violates the terms of the agreement. I felt a surge of vindication. We hadn't just been paranoid young entrepreneurs, we'd been smart. We'd protected ourselves against exactly the situation I now faced. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Horizon Energy formally suspended their orders pending resolution of the IP dispute. Two other international partners followed suit. The stock price continued to slide, and industry publications began running more detailed articles about Argentum's succession planning challenges. Nathan's response was to escalate the conflict. He sent me a formal letter accusing me of deliberate sabotage and breach of fiduciary duty. The letter demanded that I immediately withdraw the revocation notice and threatened both civil and criminal prosecution if I continued to interfere with company operations. I showed the letter to Henry, who smiled grimly. "They're getting desperate," he said. "This is exactly the kind of overreach that will help us in court." "Are we going to court?" "Almost certainly. They can't afford to let this stand, and you can't afford to back down. But I think there's one more thing we should do first." "What's that?" "We should give them a very clear demonstration of what they're dealing with. They seem to think you're bluffing." The demonstration came in the form of a detailed analysis of Argentum's product lines, prepared by an independent patent attorney. The analysis showed that 68% of the company's revenue came from products that directly incorporated my innovations. More importantly, it showed that those products would be impossible to manufacture without infringing on the patents I still owned. Henry delivered the analysis to Margaret Chen, along with a letter offering to negotiate a new licensing agreement. The terms were simple: restore my authority over the technologies I'd created, or face the consequences of patent infringement. Margaret's response was swift and angry. She filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I was attempting to extort the company and seeking an injunction to prevent me from interfering with their operations. The lawsuit was filed on Friday afternoon, clearly timed to generate maximum weekend media coverage. The strategy backfired. Instead of portraying me as a disgruntled employee trying to hold the company hostage, the lawsuit drew attention to the underlying IP issues. Journalists began asking questions about the company's ownership of its core technologies. Industry analysts started examining the legal filings more closely. Most importantly, the lawsuit forced Margaret to make public statements about the company's rights to its intellectual property. Those statements, it turned out, were easier to make than to prove. The discovery process began 3 weeks later. Henry had prepared extensively, and we had boxes of documents ready to submit. The original partnership agreements, the patent filings, the correspondence with early investors. Everything was organized and cross-referenced. What we found in the company's files was more interesting than what we'd brought. There were emails between Nathan and Brendan discussing legacy IP issues and the need to consolidate control. There were memos from Margaret Chen warning about potential problems with the original licensing agreements. Most damaging of all, there were communications with Cortland Holdings' legal team acknowledging that certain patents remained under the control of the original founders. They had known. They had known about the licensing agreements, about my retained rights, about the risks of forcing me out. They had decided to proceed anyway, gambling that I wouldn't fight back or that they could intimidate me into submission. The trial began in November. The courtroom was packed with industry observers, journalists, and employees from both sides. I sat at the plaintiff's table, watching as Henry methodically presented our case. The evidence was overwhelming. The original partnership agreements clearly established my ownership of the core technologies. The patent filings showed that I was the primary inventor on all the key innovations. The licensing agreement gave the company permission to use my IP, but it didn't transfer ownership. Margaret Chen's defense was built around the argument that anything I developed had automatically become company property through my employment agreement. But the employment agreement had been signed years after the core technologies were created, and it contained no retroactive provisions. The most dramatic moment came when Peter Klein testified about the circumstances surrounding the original agreements. He described how we'd worked 18-hour days in his garage, how we'd pooled our resources to buy equipment, how we'd carefully documented everything we created. "We knew we were onto something big," he said, "but we also knew that if we weren't careful, someone else would end up owning what we'd built." The licensing agreement was our insurance policy. Nathan's testimony was less compelling. Under cross-examination, he admitted that he'd never read the original partnership agreements before proposing to eliminate my position. He acknowledged that he'd been aware of potential IP issues, but had assumed they could be resolved through negotiation. "You assumed," Henry said, "that Ms. Caldwell would simply accept whatever terms you offered?" "I assumed she would act reasonably," Nathan replied. "And when she didn't accept your terms, you accused her of sabotage?" "I accused her of putting her personal interests ahead of the company's. The company that was built on technologies she created?" Nathan's face reddened. "The company that employed her for 17 years. The company that was trying to force her out? We were trying to restructure. You were trying to eliminate her position while continuing to profit from her innovations. Is that correct?" Nathan's answer was barely audible. "Yes." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. The company had breached its licensing agreement by attempting to eliminate my role, and I had the right to revoke their license to use my intellectual property. But the legal victory was only the beginning. The real question was what would happen next. The company had 30 days to appeal the verdict, and they'd already announced their intention to do so. Meanwhile, the revocation notice remained in effect, and the clock was still ticking. The appeal process would take months, possibly years. During that time, the company would be stuck in legal limbo, unable to resolve the IP dispute, but also unable to move forward with their restructuring plans. The uncertainty would continue to hurt their stock price, their partnerships, and their ability to attract new investment. I could have ended it all with a phone call. I could have agreed to a new licensing arrangement that preserved my rights while allowing the company to move forward. But I'd learned something important during the trial. Nathan and Brendan had never intended to honor any agreement they made with me. They'd seen me as an obstacle to be eliminated, not a partner to be respected. So I waited. I watched as the company's stock price continued to slide, as more international partners suspended their contracts, as industry analysts downgraded their recommendations. I watched as Nathan's position became increasingly precarious, as Brendan faced growing pressure from the board, as Margaret Chen struggled to manage a case she'd never expected to lose. The final blow came from an unexpected source. A financial journalist named David Chen had been following the case closely, and he'd begun investigating the broader implications of the IP dispute. His research revealed that Argentum's entire business model was built on technologies that the company didn't actually own. Chen's exposé ran in the Wall Street Journal on a Tuesday morning. The headline read, "The $300 million House of Cards: How Argentum Innovations Built an Empire on Borrowed IP." The article detailed the company's dependence on my innovations, the legal challenges to their ownership claims, and the potential consequences of losing access to the core technologies. The market reaction was swift and brutal. Argentum's stock price plummeted by 40% in a single day. Trading was suspended twice to allow for cooling-off periods, but each resumption brought fresh waves of selling. By the end of the week, the board had called an emergency meeting. By the following Monday, both Nathan and Brendan had been forced to resign. Margaret Chen was reassigned to a lesser role, and the company began reaching out to Henry about negotiating a settlement. I let them wait another week before agreeing to a meeting. When I finally walked into the conference room, I found a very different group of people than the ones who had tried to force me out 6 months earlier. The new interim CEO was Janet Morrison, a veteran of the sustainable energy industry who had a reputation for collaborative leadership. The new head of HR was someone I'd worked with before, someone who understood the company's history and culture. "Meredith," Janet said, rising to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone." "Difficult," I agreed, "but necessary." "We'd like to discuss terms for a new licensing agreement," she said. "One that recognizes your contributions and ensures your continued involvement in the company's future." I looked around the table at the faces of people who had watched silently while Nathan and Brendan had tried to eliminate me. Some of them looked ashamed. Others looked relieved. All of them looked worried about the company's future. "I'm willing to discuss terms," I said, "but I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about licensing agreements or corporate reorganizations. This is about respect. It's about acknowledging that some things can't be bought or sold or transferred. It's about understanding that the people who build something have a stake in what happens to it. We understand, Janet said, and we're committed to making this right. The negotiations took 3 weeks. In the end, we reached an agreement that restored my authority over the technologies I'd created, guaranteed my role in any future strategic decisions affecting those technologies, and provided compensation for the months of uncertainty and legal expenses. More importantly, the agreement established a new governance structure that prevented any single executive from making unilateral decisions about the company's core assets. The original founders, those of us who were still alive and willing to participate, would have permanent seats on a technical advisory board with veto power over major technology decisions. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. It protected my interests while allowing the company to move forward. It acknowledged my contributions while providing a framework for continued collaboration. The day I signed the new agreement, I walked through the building that housed the company I'd helped create. The laboratories were humming with activity. The production floors were busy with orders, and the offices were filled with people working on projects that would shape the future of sustainable energy. Some of those people had been with the company since the early days. Others had joined more recently, attracted by our reputation and our mission. All of them were part of something larger than themselves, something that had started with a few crazy ideas and a lot of hard work. I thought about Nathan Grant, who had seen me as nothing more than a line item on a budget spreadsheet. I thought about Brendan Locke, who had reduced 17 years of innovation to legacy costs. I thought about the board members who had nodded along with their plans, never bothering to understand what they were really voting to destroy. They had forgotten that companies aren't just collections of assets and liabilities. They're communities of people working toward common goals. They're repositories of knowledge and experience that can't be easily replaced. They're built on relationships and trust and shared commitment to something meaningful. When you forget those things, when you treat people as disposable and knowledge as commodity, you create vulnerabilities that can destroy everything you've built. You create situations where a single name on a single document can bring down an entire empire. I had never wanted to be in that position. I had never wanted to hold the power to shut down the company I'd helped create. But when they forced me into that corner, when they made it clear that my only choices were submission or destruction, I chose to remind them of something they'd forgotten. Some names carry weight, some signatures have power, and some people, when pushed too far, will use every legal and legitimate tool at their disposal to protect what they've built. The $300 million empire they'd tried to steal from me was still standing. But it was standing on a foundation they finally understood they couldn't ignore, controlled by agreements they couldn't simply tear up, dependent on innovations they couldn't replicate. I was still there, still contributing, still building something extraordinary. But now everyone knew exactly what that meant, and exactly what it would cost them if they ever forgot again. The quarterly earnings report that came out 3 months later showed record profits. The stock price had recovered and was climbing toward new highs. The international partnerships were stronger than ever, and new contracts were being signed every week. In the footnotes of the annual report, there was a brief mention of resolved intellectual property matters and strengthened founder agreements. Most shareholders probably didn't pay attention to those details. They were focused on the bottom line, on the growth projections, on the quarterly dividends. But I knew what those footnotes really meant. They meant that the company's future was secure, that the innovations we'd created would continue to power the sustainable energy revolution, and that the people who had built this empire would always have a voice in what happened to it. It had taken 6 months, a lawsuit, and the near collapse of a $300 million company to teach that lesson. But sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that cost the most to learn. And sometimes, the most effective way to teach those lessons is to remind people that the names on the founding documents aren't just there for decoration. They're there because some things, once created, can never be uncreated. Some rights, once established, can never be simply wished away. Some signatures, once made, last forever.